My name is Frank. I'm 66 years old, retired after 4 decades as an accountant. People used to joke that I could balance a budget in my sleep. Maybe they were right. Numbers have always been my anchor. While other men built barns or raised cattle, I kept ledgers. Every client I ever worked for, every bill paid, every loan made, I wrote down in neat, square letters. When Marlene, my wife, was alive, she used to tease me about the big leather-bound book I carried from house to house. "That ledger's like your Bible," she'd say, laughing as she set dinner on the table. I'd smile back, because in a way it was true. I trusted memory, but I trusted ink more. After she passed 3 years ago, the farmhouse grew quieter. I filled the silence by keeping that ledger alive. Not just for business anymore, for family too. When Brian, my oldest, borrowed $5,000 to patch his roof, I logged it. When Emily needed help covering college tuition, I noted the date, the amount, the repayment plan we agreed on. It wasn't about control. It was about fairness. If my children asked what I'd done for them, or if the day came when inheritance questions got ugly, the truth would be there in black and white. The house itself isn't much. 2 stories of creaking wood, paint peeling on the porch, garden long since gone wild. But it's mine. I bought it in '84, 1 month after Emily was born, and every board has soaked up my sweat. The thought of leaving it behind one day didn't scare me. The thought of losing it wrongly, that terrified me. On a Sunday evening not long ago, I closed the ledger after updating a small loan I'd given Brian again. This time for a business opportunity he'd sworn would change his life. The book was thick now, nearly full, the spine cracked but sturdy. I placed it back in the drawer under my bed and went to wash up for dinner. When I walked into the dining room, Brian and his wife sat stiffly at the table, their eyes cold, as if they'd been waiting for me with something sharp to say. Brian stabbed at his meatloaf with a fork, eyes fixed on me. Lydia, his wife, leaned back in her chair with that smug half-smile she always wore when she had something cruel loaded on her tongue. "Dad," Brian began, voice flat. "Lydia and I have been talking. You can't keep running this place like some accounting office. This is supposed to be a home, not a spreadsheet." I set my glass down carefully. "I don't understand," Lydia chuckled. "Of course you don't. You measure everything in dollars and cents. You don't know how to just love without keeping score. Every time you help us, it's another line in that stupid old book." My jaw tightened. That stupid old book is the reason you had a roof when your shingles gave way. The reason Emily could finish college without debt. It's not about scorekeeping. It's about truth. Brian slammed his fork down, startling his daughter in the high chair. "Truth? The truth is, you're a bitter old man who cares more about ink on a page than his own family. You hide behind that ledger because it's the only power you've got left." The words landed heavy. He wasn't just ungrateful. He was angry that I hadn't simply erased myself for his convenience. Lydia's eyes flicked around the dining room walls. "This house is wasted on you, Frank. Look at it. Falling apart, cluttered with papers nobody cares about. Brian and I could make it worth something again, but you cling to it like it's all you've got." Her smile sharpened. "Maybe it is." I stood slowly, palms flat on the table. "This house is mine. That ledger is mine. And I won't apologize for keeping proof of what I've given." Brian met my gaze, unblinking. "You won't have either for long. You're not the man you think you are, Dad. Times are changing. You can't hide behind numbers forever." The room went quiet, except for the hum of the fridge. For the first time in my life, I saw not my son, but an adversary across the table. And I realized with a chill running down my spine, that this was just the beginning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds as I reached under my bed for the ledger. My fingers touched empty wood. I shoved the drawer open wider, heart pounding. The space where the book had rested for decades was bare. I tore through the room, closet, desk, shelves, but the ledger was gone. My chest tightened like a vice. That book held every record, every promise. Without it, I was nothing but a forgetful old man with stories no one believed. I stormed downstairs. Brian sat at the kitchen counter sipping coffee, Lydia scrolling her phone beside him. They looked up like they'd been expecting this. "Where is it?" I demanded. Brian raised his mug lazily. "If you mean that ratty old book, don't bother looking." Lydia smirked. "We burned it. Last night. Out back by the fire pit. Watched the smoke rise and everything. Quite the little ceremony." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "You burned my ledger?" Brian leaned in, voice low and taunting. "Nobody cares about your numbers, Dad. Nobody cares about your scribbles. All that proof you thought gave you power? Gone." I shook my head. "You had no right." Lydia tapped her manicured nail against her coffee cup. "We have every right. This is our home now. You should be thanking us for putting an end to your obsession. You'll be happier without that dead weight." The rage rose so hot I could taste iron in my mouth. That ledger wasn't obsession. It was memory. It was truth. You erased 40 years of sacrifice because you couldn't stand being reminded of it. Brian's smile widened. "Truth? The only truth that matters is what people believe. And right now, everyone believes you're old, tired, and clinging to scraps of paper. The deed's already moving in my favor. That book was the only thing standing between you and the graveyard of relevance." I stood there, fists trembling, staring at my own son like he was a stranger. Brian leaned back, smug. "Face it, Dad. You're finished." That Friday afternoon, I was patching a loose shutter when Mrs. Alvarez, my neighbor, wandered over. She held a plate of cookies, but her eyes carried pity. "Frank," she began hesitantly, "I don't mean to stir things, but you should know what was said at the Hendersons' barbecue." I wiped my hands on a rag. "Go on." Her voice dropped. "Brian was laughing, telling folks you kept some silly old ledger because you're senile. He said you thought paper could save you, but you'd already signed everything over to him." "People laughed, Frank. They think you've lost your grip." The rag slipped from my hand. My own son, mocking me like a clown act for neighbors I'd fixed cars for, loaned tools to, shared beers with. "Thank you for telling me," I managed, though my throat burned. She gave my arm a squeeze before leaving. That night, I walked toward the back door, key in hand. The lock wouldn't turn. I tried again, harder. Nothing. They'd changed it. Through the window, I could see my granddaughter coloring at the kitchen table, Lydia stirring a pot, Brian laughing with a glass of wine. My home glowed warm, and I was locked out in the cold. I sat on the porch steps until the night deepened, the sound of their laughter cutting into me like glass. Headlights swept across the driveway. A familiar Ford pickup pulled in, engine rumbling. Out stepped Wallace, an old client, now more friend than anything. He'd run a supply company for years, and I'd kept his books back when I still worked. Gray at the temples now, but his eyes hadn't dulled. He climbed the steps and sat beside me. "Heard about what Brian's been saying," he muttered. "The whole town's buzzing." I shook my head. "He took my ledger, Wallace. Burned it. My proof is gone." Wallace let out a slow breath. "Maybe that book's gone, But you think a man like you never left copies. I've still got half the ledgers you did for my business in the '80s. You don't erase truth that easy. I looked at him, hope flickering where only ashes had been. He clapped my shoulder. Don't let him bury you alive, Frank. Numbers don't lie. And sooner or later, lies collapse under their own weight. As his truck pulled away, I sat in the dark, hands clenched. Betrayal burned hot in my chest, but somewhere beneath the anger, something else stirred. Resolve. Monday morning, I drove into town to withdraw some cash for groceries. I stood in line at First Valley Bank, clutching my worn checkbook. When the teller pulled up my account, her polite smile flickered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hall," she said quietly. "Your account shows a zero balance." My stomach dropped. "That's not possible. There should be—" She turned the monitor slightly, pointing at 3 large withdrawals over the past 2 weeks. Each slip bore my name at the bottom, though I had never signed them. The letters were stiff, almost mechanical. "Those aren't my signatures," I rasped. "I understand," she whispered. "But unless you file a fraud claim, the system recognizes them as valid." I walked out of the bank lightheaded, the Arizona sun stabbing my eyes. 40 years of savings, gone. And in its place, forged paper with my stolen name. That night I ate from a cold can of beans in the shed. The farmhouse lights glowed through the curtains. I could hear clinking glasses, muffled laughter. Brian and Lydia throwing another dinner like kings in a castle I built. I sat on the workbench with Marlene's photo propped against a jar of nails. "They've taken everything, honey," I whispered. "The house, the ledger, the money. All that's left is me, sitting here like a ghost." Even Laura's voice reached me through the night. "Mommy, can Grandpa come inside?" I heard her ask through the window. Lydia's answer was sharp, dismissive. "Grandpa belongs out there. Don't worry about him." The words hollowed me out. My own granddaughter being taught I was an outsider, a burden. I sank onto the cot, hunger still gnawing though the can was empty. My hands shook as I imagined Brian counting my stolen money, Lydia smirking over a glass of wine. For the first time, I wondered if they'd truly succeeded. If maybe I had been erased, my memory burned, my savings drained, my reputation mocked, and in that moment, alone in the shed with the night pressing close, I believed what Brian wanted everyone to believe, that I was finished. 2 days later, I was still in the shed when I heard tires crunching on gravel. Wallace's truck rolled up, headlights washing across the tools. He stepped out with a cardboard box in his arms. "Couldn't sleep," he said, setting the box on my workbench. "Thought you might need these." Inside were binders, manila folders, even photocopies yellowed with age. My own handwriting stared back at me. Numbers, balances, notes in the margins. Records I'd kept for Wallace's supply company and a dozen other clients who'd long since retired. "I dug through storage," Wallace explained. "Turns out I never threw anything away. Half the county's got boxes like this. You were meticulous, Frank. Too meticulous for your son to erase." I flipped through page after page. My handwriting, my initials, clients' signatures, proof of transactions going back decades. They hadn't just taken money from me. They'd stolen from the men and women who trusted me to keep order. Something inside me shifted. The despair that had weighed like lead began to crack, replaced by a heat in my chest I hadn't felt in years. "They think I'm finished," I said slowly. "But they don't realize truth leaves traces. You burn one ledger, there's still 100 echoes scattered across town." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "Exactly. and those echoes can speak louder than Brian's lies. I held up one binder, its cover smudged but solid. If I can gather enough of these, copies, witnesses, signatures, then I can prove what's been done, prove what they've stolen. Wallace leaned closer. And not just prove, you can make them answer for it. Law, court, whatever it takes. The fire in my chest grew hotter. For days I'd eaten scraps, locked out like a stray dog. But as I flipped another page, saw another balance neatly written in my careful hand, I realized I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I closed the binder, steady now. Brian wanted a dead man. Instead, he just woke me up. I spread Wallace's binders across the shed table like a battlefield map. Dusty pages, faded ink, but solid. Each one a bullet my son didn't know I still carried. Step 1 was simple. Gather allies. Wallace promised to call old clients. Folks who still had copies of the records I'd kept. Receipts, tax stubs, letters with my handwriting. Proof that my system existed beyond that one ledger. Step 2. Document the theft. My bank account had been drained by forged signatures. I knew my handwriting better than anyone. Shaky sometimes, but never mechanical the way Brian had scrawled my name. The teller had been sympathetic. If pressed, she'd testify. Step 3. Set the trap. I needed Brian to reveal himself, to speak his arrogance aloud. I still had my old tape recorder, the kind that fit in a pocket. Outdated, sure, but reliable. If he thought the old man was begging, maybe he'd loosen his tongue. Step 4. Expose in public. Not a private squabble, not whispers over fences. A reckoning in front of neighbors, family, anyone who thought I'd gone soft in the head. Wallace listened as I laid it out. Dangerous game, he muttered, but his eyes gleamed. Still, it's the only way. You can't fight shadows with silence. I nodded. Brian thinks burning one book erased me. I'll show him the truth doesn't burn. I began sorting the papers into piles. Bank records, client ledgers, personal notes. Every page I touched steadied me. Every number reminded me of who I was. Not some doddering fool, but a man who had built a life on precision, on honesty. By midnight, the plan was carved into my mind. The evidence would speak, the trap would spring, and the mask my son wore would finally crack. I set the recorder on the table, its red button winking in the lamplight. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Tomorrow, the hunt began. 2 mornings later, I drove Wallace's pickup into town. My son thought he had me stranded at the farm, but I still had friends. The first stop was the courthouse records office. I requested copies of the original property deed, the one Marlene and I had signed together 30 years ago. The clerk pulled out a thick binder and, after some digging, slid photocopies across the counter. My name, her name, clear as day, notarized in 1993. Can I keep these? I asked. She nodded. Certified copies are $5 each. I paid in cash, tucking them into a folder. Physical evidence #1. The land wasn't Brian's to claim alone. Marlene's name was still etched into those pages, meaning half the deed was tied to her estate, and therefore contested unless probated properly. Brian had forgotten that detail. Next, Wallace drove me to his friend's print shop. There I scanned copies of the old ledgers he'd dug up, creating fresh, crisp records with my signature visible. By the time I left, I had a stack thick enough to choke the lie Brian had been feeding everyone. But I wasn't done. That evening, I walked up to the farmhouse porch, folder in hand. Lydia opened the door, irritation flashing in her eyes. "You can't keep coming around," she hissed. I held up the folder. "Tell Brian I found what he missed." She laughed. Your little scraps of paper? Nobody cares. Then he won't mind proving it, I said, setting the folder down on the porch chair. I'll be back tomorrow. He can explain it to my face. Her smile faltered. Explain what? But I was already walking away. In the shed, I placed the recorder in my shirt pocket, testing the button. The red light blinked steady. Tomorrow I'd confront Brian directly, not with anger, but with evidence that couldn't be burned away. For years I had believed fairness came from patience, from trust. Now I knew better. Fairness had to be built, piece by piece, and wielded like a hammer. And tomorrow, I'd start swinging. The next evening, I walked up to the porch with my recorder snug in my breast pocket. Brian was already outside, beer in hand, as if he'd been waiting for me. Lydia leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. You got a lot of nerve showing up here, Brian said, grinning like a man who thought the game was won. I held up the folder. Certified deed copies. Marlene's name is still on them. Half this farm belongs to her estate, not you. You've been telling people it's yours outright. Care to explain that? His grin twitched. Old paperwork. Doesn't matter. I'm executor. No, I said evenly. You're not. There was never probate, which means your claim is smoke. And smoke clears fast. He laughed too loudly. You think some dusty forms change anything? Everyone believes me. Neighbors, church, even the bank. They think you're a washed-up old man clinging to fairy tales. That's so? I asked quietly. Yes, that's so, he snapped. I've been running this place. I burned that stupid ledger so nobody would see how pathetic you are. Keeping score like a hall monitor. And I drained the accounts because guess what, Dad? You weren't using the money anyway. I was. For this family. For me. For Lydia and Laura. It's mine now. All of it. Every word sank into the recorder, his arrogance crisp and clear. You forged my name, I said flatly. He didn't even flinch. Of course I did. Because you'd never sign willingly. You'd rather rot in that shed with your memories. Well, memories don't pay bills. I do. I'm the future here, not you. Lydia shifted nervously. Brian, shut up, he barked. He needs to hear it straight. You're finished, Dad. Your ledger's gone. Your bank account's mine. Your reputation's a joke. Nobody's going to believe you. I let the silence hang. Let the recorder drink in his triumph. Then I leaned forward just enough for him to see the steel in my eyes. You've mistaken silence for surrender, son, and you just handed me the rope to hang you with. By dawn the next morning, the threats began. My old flip phone buzzed with a voicemail from Brian. His voice was sharp, no trace of the smug confidence from last night. You pull another stunt, old man, and I'll make sure you regret it. You think those papers mean anything? I'll tell the bank you're losing your mind. I'll tell the sheriff you're harassing us. Nobody will take you seriously. Drop this, or you'll never see Laura again. The words chilled me. He wasn't just cutting me off. He was using my granddaughter as a weapon. An hour later, a letter slid under the shed door in Lydia's handwriting. Frank, for your own sake, stop. Brian is right. You're not well. Everyone sees it. If you keep pushing, we'll have no choice but to file a competency petition. The court will side with us. Please, don't ruin what's left of your dignity. I crumpled the letter in my fist. They wanted to erase me on paper and in flesh. That afternoon, as I sat staring at the folder of evidence, I heard tires on gravel. A sheriff's cruiser eased into the yard. Out stepped Deputy Clara Hayes, young, steady-eyed, someone I'd once helped with tax advice when her father died. She looked at me not like a burden, but like a man she remembered. "Mr. Hall," she said gently, "I heard you've been locked out of your own house, and I heard Brian's telling folks you're slipping." I stiffened. "That what brought you here? To check if the old man's gone crazy?" She shook her head. "No, sir. I came because my dad's old records still have your handwriting all over them. I know the kind of man you are, and I don't like hearing your name dragged through the mud." I slid the folder across the workbench. She flipped through the certified deed, the copied ledgers, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. "Brian signed withdrawals in my name," I said. "He admitted it last night. I have it on tape." Clara's jaw tightened. "If that's true, we've got forgery, fraud, maybe even elder abuse. You're not crazy, Mr. Hall. You're in danger, and so's your estate." For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground steady beneath me. Brian thought he'd isolated me, but now a deputy, an officer of the law, was on my side. I closed the folder. Then it's time we turned his threats into his downfall. Clara returned 2 nights later, headlights off, her cruiser parked at the edge of the property. She stepped into the shed with a small satchel and shut the door behind her. "I've been digging," she said without preamble. "Talked to the bank manager. They confirmed the withdrawals from your account were signed while you were seen elsewhere. Hardware store receipts, time-stamped cameras. Alibis line up." She pulled out glossy photographs, security footage from the bank lobby. Grainy, but clear enough. Brian at the counter, Lydia hovering near the door. Both of them using your name. Physical evidence hashed too. Proof my son had not only forged me, but paraded into the bank to do it. I swallowed hard. "You're telling me we can nail them?" Clara nodded. "It's more than forgery now. It's theft, conspiracy. I'm turning this over to the county prosecutor." "But Frank, there's something else." From her satchel, she pulled a small notebook, half-charred along the edges. My breath caught. "The ledger," I whispered. "Not the whole thing," Clara admitted. "But when your son bragged at that barbecue about burning it, Mrs. Alvarez went poking around the fire pit the next morning. She found this wedged under a cinder block. Thought you might want it." The surviving pages were blackened but legible. My handwriting filled them. Dates, names, dollar figures, proof of debts settled, favors traded, promises honored. A fragment, yes, but a fragment with teeth. My hands trembled as I flipped through it. Here was a note about Wallace's supply orders in 1987, signed by him in blue ink. Another entry about Clara's father, his estate taxes, and the payment dates. People still alive could vouch for these records. Brian hadn't erased me. He'd left evidence smoldering in the ashes. Clara set her jaw. "This is enough to tip the scale. When we present this alongside the deed copies, the bank fraud, the recordings, you don't just look credible, Frank. You look like the victim of a calculated scheme." The air in the shed felt different. Lighter, charged. For weeks I'd been shoved down, silenced, made to feel invisible. Now the weight shifted. I closed the notebook and looked Clara in the eye. "Then tomorrow we stop hiding. We bring this into the light." She nodded firmly. "Tomorrow, Mr. Hall. Time to turn their lies into their noose." Saturday morning, Clara parked her cruiser at the Grange Hall, where the town meeting was already underway. I walked in beside her, folder tucked under my arm, recorder in my pocket, the half-burned ledger clutched like a weapon. Neighbors turned to stare, some with pity, some with doubt. Brian and Lydia sat up front, Laura coloring quietly beside them. The council chair cleared his throat. "Frank Hall, you asked for the floor." I stepped forward. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I opened the folder. For weeks my son has told you I'm slipping, that I'm obsessed with numbers. He burned my ledger, forged my name, and drained my accounts. He thought truth was ash, but truth doesn't burn. Murmurs rippled through the room. I lifted the certified deed copies, the notary stamp glinting under the fluorescent lights. This farm still bears my wife's name. Brian's claim is false. I laid the half-burned ledger on the table. Here are records you've all lived. Wallace's supply shipments. Clara Hayes's father's estate taxes. Pages singed but signatures intact. My neighbors' names are here. Their hands wrote them. That's not obsession. That's history. Clara stepped forward, placing the bank photos on the table. Security footage. Brian Hall withdrawing funds under his father's name. Fraud. Forgery. Gasps erupted. Brian shot to his feet, red-faced. He's lying! He's senile! I pressed the recorder's button. His voice filled the hall, crisp and damning. Of course I forged his name. The ledger was pathetic. The money's mine now. All of it. The room went dead silent. Lydia's face drained white. Laura clutched her crayon, staring at her father in confusion. The council chair's gavel struck. Deputy Hayes, arrest him! Clara moved swiftly, cuffs clicking around Brian's wrists. Lydia tried to back away, but Clara's partner blocked the door. You too, ma'am. Conspiracy and aiding fraud. As they were let out, neighbors whispered, some glaring at Brian, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Wallace clapped my shoulder. Told you, Frank, numbers don't lie. I looked at Laura, her eyes wide with fear and betrayal. I knelt down. Your grandpa kept the truth safe. That's what matters. She nodded slowly, clutching my hand. Brian shouted as he was dragged outside. You'll regret this, old man. I straightened, holding the scorched ledger high. No, son. You will. And for the first time in months, the room erupted in applause. Not for me alone, but for the truth that refused to die.